My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 68 years old, a retired civil engineer from Seattle. For 42 years, my wife Linda handled the birthdays, the holidays, the family dinners. I was the quiet one, happiest fixing a faucet or grilling burgers on a Sunday. Linda used to say people depended on me because I never complained. Maybe that was true, or maybe I just never wanted the people I loved to carry my burdens. That habit became my greatest mistake. 3 days before everything changed, I stood beside my wife's casket in Vancouver. Linda had spent her final months there with her sister, chasing one last treatment for the cancer that had turned aggressive. I flew back and forth as often as I could. Every goodbye got harder. Then one rainy Tuesday, there were no more goodbyes, just silence. The funeral was small, exactly how she wanted it. After everyone left, I stood by her grave until the groundskeeper gently reminded me they were closing. "You can come back tomorrow," he said. I smiled. "I know, but tomorrow already feels like another lifetime." The next morning, I flew back to Seattle alone, my wedding ring still on my finger. Linda used to squeeze my hand during turbulence and whisper that if we survived the flight, I owed her clam chowder. The empty seat beside me hurt more than I can describe. We landed at SeaTac a little before 5. I opened the family group chat, me, my son Brian, my daughter Melissa, Brian's wife Karen. I typed, "My flight lands at 5. Can someone pick me up?" I stared at it nearly a minute before sending. Brian replied first, "We're busy. Take an Uber." "How was the funeral? Are you okay?" 6 words, tacked on like an afterthought. Then Melissa, "Dad, you should have planned better." I read that sentence longer than I should have. Planned better. As if grief could be scheduled around soccer practice. I could have told them their mother had been buried less than a day earlier. Instead, I wrote 2 words. "No worries." Then I put the phone away, not because everything was fine, but because I finally understood something. You can't make people care. I wheeled my suitcase to the rideshare curb. An elderly woman was struggling with her bag. I lifted it into her son's trunk. "I hope someone does the same for you someday," she said. "I hope so too," I told her. That's when the explosion hit. A fuel truck had jackknifed after being struck by a speeding SUV, and cars piled into each other in a chain reaction. Smoke rolled into the sky. A sedan burst into flames. People froze, filming instead of moving. Something in me didn't. Years of emergency preparedness training took over before fear could. Someone grabbed my arm. "Sir, don't go over there." But I pulled free and ran. A young mother was pounding on a jammed window, a little girl screaming in the back seat. I grabbed broken concrete and swung it into the glass until it gave. "Cover your face," I yelled, clearing the shards. Behind me, sirens were still too far away. An officer reached me and ordered me back behind the barricade. I pointed to an overturned SUV. A hand pressed against the cracked windshield. "There's still someone inside." He sent firefighters running. Only then did I notice my hands were shaking, cut open from the glass, my sleeve scorched. None of it mattered. Someone shouted that the little girl was breathing. I closed my eyes. "Thank you, Linda." 45 minutes later, with the scene finally secured, an officer took my statement. "You should be in one of those ambulances," he said. "I've had worse," I told him. He smiled. Until I mentioned I'd buried my wife the day before. His smile disappeared. Witnesses kept correcting my account, insisting I'd gone back into the wreck 3 separate times, while everyone else just filmed. I hadn't been counting. I'd just seen people who needed help. A paramedic bandaged my hands and asked if family was coming. "They're busy," I said. She didn't push. A reporter, Emily Harper from King 5 News, asked for an interview. I refused. "What if people want to thank you?" she asked. "They don't need to," I said. She nodded and walked away without pressing, and I appreciated that. Linda always admired people who accepted no as a complete sentence. With the roads closed, police drove me to a nearby hotel. In my room, I set down Linda's travel bag. Inside was the blue sweater she'd insisted on packing but never wore. It still smelled like her. I sat on the bed holding it, and that's when I finally cried. Not for the accident, for the fact that there would never again be a text from Linda asking if I'd landed safely. Across town, my children still knew nothing. Brian had finished dinner. Karen asked if his dad made it home okay. He grabbed an Uber, "I'm sure," he said. Then his phone started ringing. a neighbor, an old friend, his boss, all asking the same thing. Turn on Channel 5. Footage from a news helicopter showed a gray-haired man climbing through a burning sedan's shattered window. Authorities say retired Seattle resident Richard Bennett repeatedly entered the crash zone before first responders secured it. Then a screenshot from the group chat, reconstructed by investigators. Richard Bennett had arrived that evening straight from his wife's funeral. Melissa saw the same footage and only managed, "Oh, Dad." My phone buzzed all night on the nightstand. I never turned it over. I woke before 6 the next morning and reached instinctively for the empty side of the bed. Cold sheets. Reality came back all at once. I finally checked my phone. 43 missed calls. Brian. "Dad, where are you? I'm sorry." Melissa. "Please don't be alone." I didn't answer. Not out of spite. I simply wasn't ready to talk. Around 8, Emily Harper knocked on my door. The hotel manager had recognized me. She wasn't there for an interview. The little girl I'd pulled from the sedan was going to be okay, and her parents wanted me to know she kept asking about the man who broke the window. I laughed for the first time in days. Meanwhile, Brian and Melissa met at my house at 7 that morning, letting themselves in with the old emergency key. Everything sat untouched. Linda's rocking chair, my work boots by the door. While straightening up, Melissa found a cedar chest under the stairs, 6 leather journals, one for each year, in Linda's handwriting. They shouldn't have opened them. They did anyway. The first entries were ordinary. Dinners, birthdays. Then, Richard sold his fishing boat today. He used every dollar for the down payment on Brian's first house. Brian would never accept it if he knew. Brian went pale. Another entry. Melissa's divorce attorney needed another payment. Richard quietly withdrew money from retirement and told the children we'd been thinking of downsizing anyway. Melissa covered her mouth. She'd believed that story for years. Page after page. Consulting work I hadn't wanted but took, because Brian's business nearly failed. A truck I never replaced, because Melissa's daughter needed braces. Skipped vacations because of tuition. Never once had I asked to be repaid. Then an entry from 4 months earlier, which Melissa read aloud through tears. The doctors in Vancouver believe there's one more treatment. Richard withdrew almost everything left in retirement. He smiled while signing the papers. But I know what it cost him. If I don't survive, I pray the children never mistake his quietness for indifference. Beneath that silence is the biggest heart I've ever known. Brian broke down. I thought Dad was just careful with money. Karen arrived with sandwiches, read 3 pages, and sat beside her husband in silence. I told him to take an Uber, Brian said. I know, Karen answered. What matters now is what you do next. I spent that afternoon on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay, where Linda used to say the ferries reminded her that life was always carrying someone home. My phone rang. Brian. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Then, through tears, Dad, come home. Words I'd wanted to hear a day earlier. I told him I wasn't ready yet and hung up, not to punish him, but because my heart needed room before it could forgive. Emily called again, not for television this time. The mayor, the governor's office, the fire department, all wanted to honor me. I declined. What she really wanted was one honest interview, because people were inventing stories about why I'd been alone at that airport. Loneliness is something a lot of people understand, she said. My father died alone in a nursing home during COVID. I never got to say goodbye. I agreed to one interview on one condition. If I didn't like a question, I didn't have to answer it. We filmed the next morning at Harborview, just 2 chairs and a camera. She asked why I kept running back into danger. I thought about 42 years with Linda, the hospitals, the long nights. When you've spent that long loving one person, I said, fear stops mattering as much. You stop asking if something is dangerous. You start asking if someone needs you. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Did my family know I was coming home? I could have told the world everything. The texts, the excuses. Instead I said, they have busy lives. They're raising families, working, balancing more than I ever did at their age. She asked why I didn't sound angry. I've had enough sadness this week, I said. There was no reason to add anger to it. That single line, they have busy lives, was the one that spread across the country. Comment sections filled with people who recognized their own fathers in it. One woman booked a flight home to her parents that same day. Brian watched alone in his office and put his face in his hands. Melissa's youngest daughter asked why Grandpa was being so nice to people who hurt him. Melissa had no answer. That evening, flowers covered my porch. Neighbors mowed my lawn without knocking. Old Mr. Jensen told a camera crew I'd quietly fixed roofs and checked on widows for 30 years and never taken a dime. Nobody had known, because I wasn't the kind of man who announced kindness. When I finally drove home that night, Brian and Melissa were waiting on the porch, phones nowhere in sight. Brian carried my suitcase inside without a word, the first time since he was 12. Melissa had made coffee using Linda's recipe. Not even close, she laughed, and it was the first real smile I'd managed since Linda died. We sat at the dining table where Linda had served 40 Thanksgivings. No television, no phones. Brian admitted he knew about the mortgage now. Melissa admitted she'd read every journal. I kept thinking about my text, she said. I would do anything to erase it. I told her she couldn't, but she could decide who she became after it. Brian asked why I hadn't destroyed them publicly when I had the chance. I thought of Linda. Public humiliation doesn't heal private wounds, I said. If millions of strangers hated you, would your mother have wanted that? He shook his head. Melissa asked if I'd been angry. Of course, I laughed. You just learn that speaking while angry usually creates another problem for tomorrow. I told them what I'd really been doing in the garage all those years, organizing screws by size, waiting until I could answer kindly. Days later, we visited Linda's memorial garden together. Brian apologized to her directly. I've spent years assuming you'd always be there, he told me. I never thought you might need us. I told him, parents spend their lives teaching children to walk. The hardest lesson is teaching them to walk back. He held on to me like a boy again, and Melissa joined us, all three of us crying under the evergreens, the sun breaking through. That night, Brian canceled a business trip and Melissa rearranged her schedule, without announcement, without asking for credit. We ordered pizza and played cards the way Linda loved. Watching my grandchildren run through the yard, I understood that the real revenge against neglect isn't punishment. It's watching the people who forgot your worth finally learn to value your presence before it's too late. It was beginning to happen. Healing arrived slowly after that, one ordinary morning at a time. Brian started showing up Saturdays with 2 coffees, canceling meetings just to sit on the porch. Melissa came by Thursdays with soup that never tasted quite like Linda's. She admitted the one ingredient she couldn't replicate was patience. My grandson Ethan wandered into the garage one afternoon and asked me to teach him to build things. We spent the day on a crooked little birdhouse. It isn't perfect, he said. Neither are families, I told him. But if the foundation is strong, it'll still stand. A month later, the fire department asked me to speak at a community preparedness event. I almost said no, then remembered Linda telling me that if your experience can help someone else, it stops being just your story. I told the room about staying calm, about looking after neighbors. When someone asked what made me run toward those cars, I said my wife spent 2 years teaching me that every extra minute matters, that when someone you love is fighting for life, you stop waiting for someone else to help. Brian eventually tried to pay back every dollar I'd spent helping him over the years. I pushed the envelope back across the table. Spend it on your kids instead, I said. Take them camping. That's a better investment than repaying me. He asked if I was really never going to let him make it right. I already got paid, I told him. You came back. On what would have been Linda's 66th birthday, the whole family gathered in the backyard, grandchildren chasing each other through her roses, Melissa's imperfect attempt at her mother's apple pie, Brian grilling burgers exactly the way I'd taught him. As the sun went down, Brian stood with a glass raised. For years, I thought success meant providing for my family, he said, voice shaking. I forgot my family also included the man who spent his whole life providing for me. I can never take back that text, but you'll never have to wonder again if someone's coming to pick you up. Melissa reached for my hand. So do I. I looked around the table, my children, my grandchildren, and the one empty chair we'd left on purpose, not because we thought Linda was sitting there, but because love has a way of staying present even after goodbye. I think your mother would be happy, I said. Brian laughed. She'd tell us the burgers are burning. Everyone laughed, and it felt wonderful. Not because the pain was gone, but because joy had finally found room to sit beside it. I've learned, in the years since, that families are rarely broken by one terrible moment. They're worn down slowly. Missed calls, unanswered texts, postponed visits, the quiet assumption that there will always be another chance. Sometimes there isn't. If this story reminds you of someone who once waited for your call, maybe today is the day to reach out. Tell them you love them while you still can. The greatest gift we give the people we love was never money, and it was never success. It was always our time.